Hello, hi from Singapore. So yeah, so today I just wanted to cover. I mean, also have three broad areas I want to look at, and which is also based on something I'm working on. So I'd love to hear your questions as well later on. I will also leave you with like maybe 2 or 3 concluding points that will make you think about this whole situation we are now. 2020 seems like a year where, I mean, a lot of things are happening at the same time. So I will also look at it from a political economy point of view, obviously relating to IR. Let me just start with the kind of, I mean, although this is not the region I'm focusing on, I just wanted to quickly start off with, say, the US-China trade war. And things are worsening, especially with the West, right? Because that kind of plays into what's happening in ASEAN and especially East Asia as well. So in order to understand that, you can see that, I mean, the Western countries, especially the US, starting with the US, and now Australia has also taken on China. So obviously the biggest point that we heard from the last presenter as well, from Surendra, is that China is a big factor in IR, in anything in today's the world scenario. So we cannot talk about anything without talking about China. But in order to talk about China, especially like in a region like ASEAN or East Asia, we need to also talk about the US and the West, because they are trying to balance they're trying to balance the situation here. So just to give you a quick snapshot of the trade, right? I'm sure not many people are, not many of you are looking at the trade as such. So just to give you a quick snapshot, more of Chinese imports, so 21%, close to 22%, 2018 data, while they only export about 7.2%. So that's like about 3 times. So they import 3 times more than what China, what they export to China. Where he's trying to increase exports to China, right? So that's the issue, and I think that's one of the main issues with many countries in the world, including many countries in ASEAN. I will get to the data there as well. So if you see that, I mean, the only country in the West, other than say, for example, Germany, which actually exports, which also imports more than that it exports, almost double. But most of the countries actually, except for Australia, which exports more to China than its imports, that trade friction over there. So, but the main point here is not that. I mean, the main point is not that China, they're trying to reduce their dependence on China, but it's more in terms of trying to get a fair deal. But as soon as they do this, you can see, for example, the Australian case where there was a pushback from China saying that they're going to raise tariffs on Australian products because they buy a lot of agricultural goods from Australia. So this is just like an intro on how the dynamics that's playing out in the relations. So in order to move quickly to the ASEAN and East Asia situation currently, we know, I mean, let me just quickly again start off with the data itself, so that you can get an idea of what's happening, and then I'll just explain what are the repercussions of this. So the problem with ASEAN and East Asia, including say Japan and Korea, is that they're more reliant on China than the West. So if you saw in the US was about 22%, right? So but while export was 7% and import was 22%. So let me just share you some data for you quickly. So for Japan, it's about 25. I mean, if you include Hong Kong, it's about 25% exports to China, and 23% import from China. South Korea is about 26 plus, 32% or so of exports to China, and 20% of imports from China. Indonesia, which is the largest heavyweight in ASEAN, which is close to about 15% exports of the total exports to China, and 25% imports. Singapore is about 20% plus and 13% import. So, I mean, the main point here, I mean, I can run through all the countries, but we can get into this details if you want later on. But essentially, the main point is for Asia, right? The main thing is that it's more tightly integrated. So it's 25% or so of their trade is going to China directly, import and export together. Plus, if you see, I mean, that's how integrated they are. And then if you see the export more, for example, Japan and Korea, or other like Singapore, for example, is reliant more on exports towards China. So there's this whole concept of appeasing China, right? So we know that. In fact, in Asia, if you see the ones that are very reliant on say Chinese exporting to China is actually India and Indonesia. So most of the other countries are actually exporting as well to China. So China has a more leverage in terms of saying what they do. Uh, they can say what they want with ASEAN and get away with it, because most of the leaders would not want to take too much pressure from China, because they rely on China for a lot of exports and imports. And because of the just to tie into my previous quick snapshot on the relations with China, relations with the West, trade relations. So you can kind of see that trade is actually driving, or say economic relations is driving the relations here as well. The main point here is that compared to the West, Asia is more deeply, especially East Asia, sorry, is more deeply integrated with China. So that's the biggest point. So that's the introduction. So in order to understand how this impacts the COVID situation now, is that there's a big change going on. It's although it's not going to be immediate, unlike India's case, which is came out suddenly, and then there's a huge impact, like with especially announcements like Chinese apps being closed and not being allowed to run in the country, which will have a huge impact on India. But just to tell you, for India, right, we only export about 5% to China, while the imports is about 15%. So it's actually it's also I mean, the general trend is that we, there are, I mean, most countries that are able to stand up to China are the ones that are importing more from China than exporting. So those are the countries that have the power. So that's the main point I want to make clear. So when you see with ASEAN, it's the opposite problem, because many of them also, ASEAN and East Asia, the biggest problem is that they export more to China, so they are more reliant on what China has to say. And that's one problem that does not allow them to kind of push back as much as they would like to. So that's a crisis. That's a small crisis for them now. Although, as I'm going to explain in terms of security, the case is slightly different. So when you see in terms of the politics, I mean, the politics, China is also trying to influence, is playing a role in where China is maybe not directly influencing domestic politics, but like in Sri Lanka, or in or what's happening in Pakistan, they do kind of give a quiet rubber stamp to not completely like a rubber stamp as such, but more in terms of some like support. So that you can see in most countries. But although that's not particularly the case, for example, in the two or three larger countries in ASEAN, which is basically Indonesia, which recently also had a kind of the EEZ standoff with China in the South China Sea. But the president immediately went to the islands and kind of asserted his control over the island right after there was a standoff there. So that's been the case. But interestingly, let me just show you some a little just point out some more data in terms of what's happening in the security point of view from ASEAN. So right before India had its standoff, right, it's kind of interesting to note that uh, China also had standoffs starting from January with Indonesia EEZ. Then it had the Vietnam standoff where uh, it sunk a Vietnamese fishing boat in April. In May, it had a Malaysian standoff. Then India was in last month, and it also had a standoff with China. So that's like basically, if you count that, that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 countries, including India, in the last 4 months. So while the COVID is going on, they're also able to, push territorial or their the expansionist idea on all these countries. So you can see the kind of pushback that's going to follow, right? But the problem is the impact is less on ASEAN, because ASEAN countries, as I mentioned, because of trade driving all this, is going to curtail or constrict the kind of pushback that they can actually do. So in spite of all these standoffs that they had in terms of security, there wasn't a pushback as much as India is doing right now. So in that sense, I think in countries as we saw in the West and as we see in Asia, the main point I'm trying to drive here is that the countries that are less reliant on exports to China, in fact, more, or you can say are reliant more on Chinese imports, can actually stand up to China. So that's a big point that we need to, I mean, the rest of the year and in the near future. So that's something that's really that's important. So that's the political economy aspect. So in security, I just kind of told you that this is what's happening. So unfortunately, ASEAN, the grouping of 10 countries here, starting with the 5 countries in the earlier and then the +5 now, so total of 10 countries, do not really, I mean, they want to have good relations with China, so that they do not have, they officially do not have this kind of standoffish issue with China. So the countries actually have more, they handle China on a bilateral kind of, uh, on a bilateral way. So that's the way it's being handled right now. There is a pushback in ASEAN on China, but just to give you a quick snapshot of ASEAN 10 countries is about 650 million people. That's half the size of India, but the economy is as big as India. So it's like 3 trillion dollar economy. So if you see that, that basically tells you that average ASEAN citizen is about like double as prosperous or double as rich as an Indian citizen. So that's the kind of, so they are doing economically well. They are expanding. I mean, they reduced tariffs to zero, although they have other non-tariff barriers, but they are been pushing towards more regionalism. So just like Surendra was talking about in terms of in India and SAARC being the problem there being unity. Here the problem, here's an asset, because they are quite a successful regional grouping outside EU. So that's really helping them. And I think that will become better over after this. So that's really going to that's another important point I want to push today, saying that this is going to be a driver for them to actually unite more, because they see more China as a threat. They are more, I mean, since so as I was mentioning to you about trade, another issue that we are seeing with all the data that I just told you about is that it's funny that we talk about China and how we have to stand up to China, but we all every country, almost major country in the world, is reliant on China for trade, and that kind of drives. So economics is actually driving the politics and security. So in a way, it justifies what China can do security-wise, and there's not much pushback. So after US pushback in the last few years, and then now maybe a beginning of through, but this is a point where I think we are at maybe a reorganizing or a regrouping or a refocusing of say alliances and friendships or whatever you call that. Right? So maybe ties as well, economic ties and other ties. So I think that's the third thing I'm going to push at in terms of a post COVID-19 situation. So in terms of the impact, right? So we see that many countries are also trying to move out their supply chains out of China. Obviously, this is going to be very tough, and it's not going to be immediate. So it's going to take some time. So as far as, for example, my reading is concerned, I see at least a few years. But the thing is that the momentum has started. So it's already started before the COVID-19. So COVID-19 is just maybe it's just going to escalate this. So, but before COVID-19, we saw the trade war, and now we see more Western countries actually bandwagoning together. So other groupings as well, kind of standing up to China and trying to reduce the reliance on trade with China. So okay, what's the point there? So the point is that for ASEAN and East Asia, it means that it is the choice of destination for moving supply chains out of China. So if supply chains move out, I mean, as Indians, and I mean, I'm an Indian too. So as all of us we would want supply chains to come to India, but unfortunately, that's not going to happen in the near term. Unfortunately, because India has not done much in terms of say opening up towards FDI and easing, say, business making it easier for business to come in. So that's going to be I mean, it's going to affect India. Obviously, it's going to change things. I think India still has a lot to gain from this, but then ASEAN has more to gain. So I think, for example, Japanese. I'm just working on a small paper that talks about how Japanese supply chains are actually they are moving out in terms of so it's exporting out of China to other countries. They might move all those factories to ASEAN because they already have a huge presence in ASEAN, including say Vietnam and countries like even Indonesia, which is kind of non-competitive, considered non-competitive recently. So ASEAN is greatly to benefit from the the China-US trade war and whatever is happening with the COVID situation and from the post-COVID situation. So yeah, so I just want to basically, I mean, I just got a minute or so left, so I just want to conclude saying, so these are things that that I just want you to start thinking about in terms of, looking at the future. So I don't think it's going to be very clear in terms of what's going to happen because that China is going to be aggressive. Unfortunately, China has also got this kind of very archaic kind of perception towards the world and to ASEAN. So it wants to dominate Asia, and that's one thing. It also is trying to take the balance of power to some medieval time where it thinks that it controls Asia. So that's something that I don't think it'll happen in the long run, but maybe in the short run they might succeed because they do have all the financial power and the military power. Security wise, political power of course they don't have because there's a huge pushback right now. And the second part is that I think a lot of Indian scholars are also talking about is that how is uh, what kind of Asia are we going to what kind of Asia are we envisioning? Is it going to be a authoritarian kind of closed controlling state like China and the Chinese kind of one party system, or more of a authoritarian dictatorship, or are we looking at a more democratic form of government? So that in terms of democracy, we see India and Japan and Korea and Taiwan doing on top, and then we also see on the other side we see single party, say kind of rulers, say governance types such as China, Vietnam as well, and some other ASEAN countries. So in terms of political performance, I think that the biggest question would be how are we going to look at Asia in the future, and are we actually pushing in the wrong direction? So that's something that India and Quad and other groupings might need to think about. And my last takeaway for the Indian context is to see how India has to gain from all this. And I think that India really, because it's called Indochina, especially the ASEAN region, I think that India has a huger role to play. Just like Surendra was talking about in South Asia, India has a huge role to play. Not only in South ASEAN, but in Southeast Asia, but also in East Asia, because it has good allies such as allies as in close relationships with Japan and Korea, and it also has governance and trust, which and because it's moving closer to the US, I think that those ties will really help India in the years to come. So I'll conclude there. I'll be happy to take your questions if you have any later on.